This video provides an introduction to ternary form. First, we'll look at some ternary terms and types. Then we'll take a look at Schumann's Kinderscenen, Opus 15, number 6. This is one of a lovely set of character pieces. This particular one is nicknamed Important Event, or Wichtige Begebenheit in German. Next, we'll look at possible ways to expand a basic ternary form. And finally, we'll close with looking at a longer ternary form, this time from Schubert's Die schöne Müllerin. So, what is ternary form? Ternary form is a three-part form. It's usually described with capital letters representing different sections, so A, B, A in this context. In other words, we have an opening section, a contrasting middle section, and then some form of a return to that opening section. The B section is usually in a different key from A. It doesn't have to be, but it often is. The return of the A in the latter third of the form might be exact, in which case we would have an ABA form, or it might be modified to some extent, which is usually represented in the abbreviations as ABA prime. The prime is just indicating that there's been some sort of minor alteration to that last A section. Now, there's two ways to return to the original section, of course. The composer might elect to write out the original A a second time, but a simpler way, especially if it is an exact copy of the original, is to just use a da capo sign. This is more common in some genres than others. For example, da capo arias, as the name suggests, it is going back to the entire of the A section usually. Marches use this at times, a few other genres. The different types of ternary form are partially determined by what sections are tonally closed. So to just review, tonally closed means that a section begins and ends in the same key. It might have other keys in the middle of that section, but we're looking specifically at whether the beginning of that section and the end of that section are in the same key, and whether that end finish with some sort of cadence that ends on a tonic chord. Most commonly, this will be a perfect authentic cadence, but sometimes you could possibly get an imperfect authentic cadence, or far less frequently some sort of plagal cadence. So if the A section is tonally closed, especially since the A section is going to be in the tonic key, we're talking about an A section starting and ending in that tonic key and finishing with an authentic cadence most of the time. If B is tonally closed, it will start and end in the same key and finish with an authentic cadence in that key. But it doesn't have to be in the tonic key. So the entire B section could be in a different key. So for instance, if the entire B section, or at least the start and the end of the B section, are in, say, the subdominant key, that would count as tonally closed. If the start and the end of the B section are in both in the dominant key and it ends with some sort of cadence that ends on a local tonic, that would count as tonally closed. So now we're into talking about the three subtypes. First up is full-sectional. In a full-sectional ternary, all three sections, A, B, and A, are tonally closed. This is pretty common in the repertoire. In sectional ternary, either the first A section or the B section is tonally closed, but not both of them. This is also pretty common in the repertoire, especially in genres like da capo aria, for example. Continuous ternary means that neither the first A nor the first B is tonally closed. This is less common than the other two options, but it is included enough in the repertoire that it's worth knowing about. So on to our first example. Both of the examples we're going to discuss in this video happen to be instances of full sectional ternary, so all three sections will be totally closed. This is partially because this is one of the most common types of ternary forms, and partially because I'm using these two pieces to illustrate a very compact version of ternary and then a more extended version of ternary that we'll see in the other piece. But first up, we have this lovely little character piece from Schumann's Kinderscenen. As you remember, that's just German for scenes from childhood. This is the sixth in that set named Important Event. If you haven't listened to this piece, please pause the video now and go listen to this movement. What you see in front of you is a form diagram of this piece. A form diagram may come in many different styles, but what I've chosen to show here are the different sections at the top line, the ABA structure specifically. I've given a little bit more detail about phrases that we'll talk about, and then of course we have measure numbers, cadences, and key areas. The Roman numerals that you see in this form diagram, like in most form diagrams, represent key relationships, not local chords. So when you see a Roman numeral 5, for example, that means that that passage is in the dominant key, not that it is is on a dominant chord. All right, with that out of the way, you'll notice that in this particular ternary form, we have two identical A sections. There's no difference between them other than the measure numbers. In this particular piece, Schumann happened to elect to write out the second A section, though he could have easily used a da capo if he had wanted to. Each of those A sections contains a repeated parallel continuous period. These have very short phrases, 2-bar phrases in this case. And one fun thing that's kind of interesting about this is that the second pair of phrases, so the antecedent and consequent that start in bar 5, and then again the same one in bar 21, are an octave lower than the ones at the beginning of each of the A sections. What this does is it allows the repetition of the material, but if you listen to it, it basically continues a very grand downward trajectory started from the very opening of the piece all the way down through the conclusion of each A section. The B section in this case is in a contrasting key. Specifically, the B section is in the subdominant D major in relation to the tonic key of A major. And this B section happens to be in the form of a sentence. We have a short basic idea, a repetition of that basic idea, and a continuation leading to the cadence. Notice that that cadence happens to be a perfect authentic cadence. And this is not obvious from the diagram, but this B section is repeated with repeat signs. So interestingly, the B section, even though it looks shorter in terms of the amount of space it's taking up on the form diagram, it actually takes the same amount of time as the two A sections. They're balanced nicely in terms of weight and time in this piece. The A section, the B section, and the return to the A section are all tonally closed. The A sections start and end in A major and end with a perfect authentic cadence in A major. Notice that the A sections do not stay constantly in A major. There are some slight modulations to E major that immediately collapse back to A major, but what matters for something to be tonally closed is the start and end. Are those two keys the same? And in this case, they are the same, and it ends with a perfect authentic cadence, therefore the A's are tonally closed. Similarly, the B section is also tonally closed. It is in D major all the way throughout, and it ends with a perfect authentic cadence in that key. So this is what makes this particular piece an example of full sectional ternary. Next, we'll discuss a few ways of expanding a ternary form. These techniques are not unique to ternary, but they are common ways of expanding the basic ternary framework of a piece. First of all, we can have what William Kaplan would call framing functions. Specifically, if there's material before the first main section, that means that the piece has an introduction or a prelude. Introduction is a term that you can apply equally well to vocal music and instrumental music, but prelude is a term that appears a little bit more often when you're referring specifically to vocal music. Essentially, it's the instrumental introduction before the vocalist enters. At the other end of the spectrum, after the last main section, you might have a codetta, a coda, or a postlude. Again, postlude is a term that's most often reserved for vocal genres specifically. Codetta and coda can be used for either instrumental or vocal music. The difference between a codetta and a coda is just one of scale. A codetta is much shorter. It often has something like a tonic pedal or just very repetitive, short, repeating harmonic gestures. A coda is usually longer in scope and a little bit more involved both harmonically and motivically. Likewise, there are also connecting functions. So you might have transitions connecting the two sections, or any two sections in a piece generically. Again, these terms are not unique to ternary form, but transition is just a passage that connects to other things. Specifically in ternary, this would be a passage that connects the opening A section to the B section, for instance. Or similarly, there might be a retransition. A retransition is basically just a fancy name for a transition that leads us back to something we've already heard before. So in a context of a ternary piece, a retransition could appear before that last A section, getting us ready for the reprise of that A section. One piece that exhibits all of these expansions is Schubert's Mine, which is the 11th song from the set Die schöne Müllerin, the Miller's Daughter, the beautiful Miller's Daughter. As you might recall from music history class, this particular song cycle deals with a protagonist who falls in love with the miller's daughter and goes through an abundance of emotions as he attempts to court her and eventually loses her because she runs off with a hunter instead. Mine is one of the songs where the protagonist is very elated. He's very happy. He thinks that the miller's daughter is indeed his, which is why he keeps crying, mine, mine, which is, it sounds the same in English and German, even though it's spelled different. But basically, he's ecstatic at this point. And so, if you have not listened to this song, please pause the video and go listen to this. What you have in front of you, again, is another form diagram of this song showing facets of its basic structure. Again, form diagrams can't replace scores because obviously these are very selective in terms of what they show, but it is sometimes helpful to be able to see at a glance what the basic building blocks of a movement of music are. Okay, so this is a very clear ternary form. We have an A section, a B section, and an A section. The A, B, and A prime are still tonally closed. In this context, the A section starts in D major, ends in D major, ends with a perfect authentic cadence. So even though the middle of the A section does modulate to the dominant, it does still start and end in the same key. Both times, both the first and the second one. And then similarly, the B section starts in B flat major and never modulates, and it concludes with B flat major. Now, one note about the form diagrams themselves: if there's an elision between two sections, the cadence is actually closing down this B section is the PAC in measure 60. That just happens to align with the start of this next section that I'll talk about in a minute. And then A prime is only slightly different from the original A. It really just adds one really short phrase at the very end that I've bracketed here towards the bottom of the slide. B, as I mentioned earlier, is in a different key. It is entirely in that different key, though, which is one of and it ends with a perfect authentic cadence, so it is indeed tonally closed. The transition and the retransition in this piece help smooth the modulations between keys, especially since we're going from the tonic major key to the flat submediant key, so from D major to B flat major. It's a little bit easier to do that in the course of modulation via a little bit of mixture than it is to just suddenly drop into the next key. So that's what Schubert elected to include in this particular case. Notice that the transition does feature a collapse to D minor. Again, since we're moving to a key that's related to D major via mode mixture, it's flat 6 rather than the diatonic 6. It's a little bit easier to get there through the parallel key of D minor, which is what it touches on very briefly before modulating to B flat major. Similarly, the retransition starts in B flat major but reverses the process bar 60 through the downbeat of 64, taking that span of music to modulate from B flat major back to D major. And as you likely also noticed, this is framed by the same music as both prelude and postlude. Schubert seems to like to do this, where he takes the exact same music and use it for both of those functions, so it's not necessarily always going to match in every single prelude and postlude. It's entirely possible to have different stretches of music in these two locations. So mine is a good example of a ternary piece that has the three clear tonally closed sections, and each of those sections are still tonally closed, which is what makes this a full sectional ternary. But that basic full sectional ternary has been expanded slightly with the framing functions of prelude and postlude and the connecting functions of the transition and the retransition. So to emphasize a few main points, ternary is a three-part form, typically ABA, so the essence of this is a section, a contrasting section, and then a return to the opening section. The middle section contrasts in theme and often in key. Most of the time that middle B section will be in a different key, though again, it is possible to find ternary forms where the melodic contrast is what is establishing that middle section as different from the others. The harmonic flow of the form is determined by how many sections are tonally closed. So it could be just one section is tonally closed, two of them are tonally closed, or all three sections are tonally closed. And that basic ABA structure can be expanded via framing and connecting passages.